Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It's a pleasure to meet again in the context of our Democratizing Work Wage Indicator Foundation Global Workshop Series. It's very nice to see friendly faces here and new faces. And of course, if you want to open up your camera so we can at least greet each other, that's very nice. But of course, if you cannot, there is no pressure at the same time. It's truly a pleasure to welcome you today so that we can think more and learn from three great panelists about the challenges of enabling workers to govern their work. We are going to hear from a very diverse set of experiences that are closely looked at, researched by these three phenomenal researchers. So as you know, I'm just going to give a few minutes of introduction to focus our mind here. As you know, this network started at the onset of the COVID pandemic, when we actually sort of reflected back to society what it meant by recognizing workers as essential. And we intervened eventually as a very large group of 3,000 of researchers from across the globe to say that if we really wanted to express our gratitude to workers, and if really we want to recognize them as essential, it's absolutely fundamental to ask ourselves, how do we treat workers in the workplace, and do they really enjoy the rights of being, as in the police, citizens in the workplace? That is, do they have the ability to wait on the government of their lives? And of course, we know that under the current capitalist regime, most of the workplaces do not offer workers those rights. So in the Democratizing Work Manifesto, we call for granting workers the collective right to validate or veto the decisions of the firm so that they can at least get to that threshold of what democracy means, which is the consent to government. There are discussions about what it means in terms of the structural changes of the workplace, of the corporation, but there are also here a need to look at how the direct involvement of workers is actually enabled. And it's actually not because you have a structure in place that you have a culture in practice that enables workers to make the most of their rights, even though, as I said, most of the workplaces on the face of the earth are not cooperative, democratically run workplaces. So today we are going to look at the work of three researchers, bringing into the conversation their own experience with the challenges of workers trying to govern their work, trying to have a say on issues of scheduling, on issues regarding their pay, obviously, all the issues that take place in a workplace, where workers certainly do want to have a say, and in some cases they practice that. So we are going to hear from three experts here. Antoine Bonnemain will be our first panelist. He's a lecturer in work psychology and ergonomics at the University of Clermont Auvergne. This is in France. His work is in occupational psychology and ergonomics and focuses on the relationship between work, health, and empowerment. His recent publications show how conflictual cooperation at the workplace could help redefine professional relations around the quality of work in organizations to further foster deliberation. Then so thank you, Antoine, for being here with us today so that we can learn from your research. Then we will hear from Denise Kasparian. She's a researcher at the National Scientific and Technical Research Council and assistant professor in the Faculty of Social Sciences at the University of Buenos Aires in Argentina. She has a PhD in sociology, and she works on the theoretical horizons that labor unrest, especially in the cooperative sector, can unleash. Thank you so much, Denise, for being with us and sharing your research with us. Then, last but not least, we have the pleasure also to hear from Michelle Miller, who is the newly appointed Director of Innovation for the Center for Labor and a Just Economy at Harvard Law School. Michelle joined the center after a decade as the co-founder and co-director of Coworker, which is an organization that nurtures early-stage worker-led organizing across multiple industries. For instance, coworkers support workers at companies like Starbucks, Google, and Uber, among many others, to help them unite first and win wage increases, scheduling reform, hazard pay. So it's really with a lot of gratitude that I now invite Antoine to start with a 12-minute remark. So we will hear from the three speakers during 12 minutes so that we can have a really thoughtful input first. Then we will probably let the panelists interact among each others, and we will then have half an hour of conversation with all of us. And I know among all the names I see on my screen that many of you are experts in one way or another on these issues and one industry or another. So I really expect a very fruitful conversation here. Thank you, Antoine. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I will share my screen.
And Antoine, yes, we can perfectly see your screens. And when we will be past 10 minutes, I will let you know that you are 2 minutes left.
Okay, thank you. Hello, everyone. I'd like to start by thanking the organizing team for making this workshop possible. I'm an occupational psychologist and ergonomist and a lecturer at the University of Clermont-Ferrand in France. I'm not sure I'll be able to make myself clear in 12 minutes and in English, so I apologize in advance for that, and for the poor level of my English, I will do my best. So in my research work, I intervene in workplaces to experiment ways of developing the direct contribution of workers to decisions concerning their work in order to improve efficiency and health. In 2001, we published a book entitled Le Prix du Travail Bien Fait, The Price of Work Well Done, which reports on the latest advances we have made after several long-term social experiments in the Renault Flin factory, in a large elderly care facility, and at the city of Lille with the garbage collectors. In this work, the effective articulation of different forms of worker participation is an important issue for the quality and durability of workers' direct contribution to the definition of their work. History has shown particularly with the example of the Auroux laws in France. I'll come back to this in conclusion, how difficult it is to develop and maintain an efficient direct worker participation over time. And yet, direct participation and effective dialogue between management, workers, and trade unions is perhaps the best way of indexing the social negotiation of elected representatives to the concrete work problems experienced by workers, and which too often prevent them from doing a work of quality. And thus, as far as the direct contribution of workers is concerned, we need to innovate in terms of methods. In the Lille experiment, to which I return now, this innovation involved redefining the social relationship in the process of direct participation by organizing the possibility for garbage collectors to define the problems to be resolved in dialogue between themselves in the absence of the line management at first, thanks to a new function of trade reference worker before bringing these problems to the dialogue with management line. The experiment with Lille garbage collectors began in 2016 and continues today. In order to concretely experiment with the direct participation of garbage collectors and make it durable over time, we processed in 3 phases. The first phase consisted in organizing a dialogue between the garbage collectors to analyze their daily work and its obstacle with us, and initially without the line management. The second phase involved experimenting with a dialogue between these garbage collectors and the line management in the organization to find ways to act on the problems identified. During this phase, 2 garbage collectors were designated as trade referents by their work colleagues to discuss the problems to be resolved with all levels of the line management. Finally, the last phase enabled the organization to be extended to the entire Lille Waste Management Department and then to other departments in the municipality. In 2018, a tripartite committee was set up to follow up problems put on the agenda by workers. Since then, it has met 3 times a year with management, trade unions, and trade referent workers to make progress on the problems put on the agenda by the workers. This is a social regulation body that monitors the handling of work problems identified by workers' collectives and which they consider priorities to be resolved for the quality of their work. Since 2018, around 100 concrete problems have been handled in this configuration at the initiative of garbage collectors. These problems range from safety quality to general organizational issues, such as the complete reorganizations of the services working hours. Of course, this kind of organization, which enables the direct contribution of workers to be methodically structured, remains vulnerable, even if it gives them authority over their work and within the organization. Finally, the very existence of this organization is always exposed to managerial decision, despite the influence of the trade unions that monitor it over time. In other words, under current labor legislation based on the principle of subordination, nothing can completely guarantee its continuity, and its functioning is regularly destabilized by changes in management, for example, or by union changes. I'd like to make a few concluding remarks based on 2 ideas. First, to give workers greater control over their work, we need to develop new rights that reduce subordination by authorizing workers to define work with their line managers, with the support of trade unions. Lisa Herzog writes in the manifesto that it would be an important step forward to legally recognize the right of workers to express themselves collectively and individually on issues related to work and its organization. That's something I agree with. But when it comes to the law, the Auroux laws of 1982 in France, which aimed to develop employees' right of expression, have set a precedent. The laws themselves contain a number of imperfections which led to their abandonment in practice. The direct face-to-face confrontation between management and employees prevented workers from feeling legitimate in their dealings with management. Collectives had no time to prepare issues among themselves, and the place of trade unions in meeting was not well defined. As a result, the new right, initially a good idea to develop direct worker participation, did not hold up over time. And the management took advantage of the situation. In France, the Auroux law of 1982 and 1986 are still applicable today, even though they are no longer applied in practice. This example shows one thing. The law is not enough to ensure that the collective voice is heard. It shows that the exercise of law can decline when the method is deficient and when direct participation is not designed to be integrated with indirect participation. And so this is the second idea I would like to conclude with. There is a need to experiment with concrete methods that make the link between direct and indirect participation. In the manifesto, Isabel Ferreras proposes to develop the principle of co-decision by renewing the company's functioning bodies. With a bicameral system, the Work Council, its elected representatives, and the union representatives could have a collective blocking right on strategic decisions, thus giving workers leverage in their power struggle with capital. While it seems to me absolutely essential to rethink this indirect means of worker participation and their influence on the company's strategic decision, other studies highlight the risk of a disconnection between elected representatives and frontline workers. This is why, in my view, the renewal of indirect workers' participation in governance needs to be more closely linked with the effective direct workers' participation. To borrow a phrase from Saint-Just, a politician associated with French Revolution, it won't be enough to have the machine of government in our hands. Power is insufficient without the authority of workers that links it to reality. To ensure that the exercise of co-decision-making right is not disconnected from the concrete concerns of frontline workers, frontline collectives must be able to nourish the exercise of this right with authority they gained over their work, thanks to the direct participation. The function of trade referent is one of the ways we have found to achieve this articulation. A concerted effort seems essential to link up the various employee representative bodies.
So last 2 minutes.
To finish, I'd like to return to a quote from 1934 by the French philosopher Simone Weil about the workers' revolution. I think it captures very well the very important relationship between power and authority, which are the two ingredients of effective governance. A visible revolution only ever occurs as the sanction of an invisible revolution already achieved. When a social category noisily seizes powers, it is because it already silently possessed it. Otherwise, it would not have the necessary strength to seize it. Before launching the workers on the adventure of political revolution, we must find out whether there are methods likely to lead them to seize a large part of real social power silently, gradually, almost invisibly, and that we must either apply these methods or renounce the workers' revolution if they do not exist. And she adds, it is only in the factories that one can gradually come to imagine a system of this kind and put it to the test, just as the managers and company directors, the technicians, have gradually come to conceive and perfect the present system. It is this kind of methods that we aim to experiment with, and that leads us to think about the necessary articulation of forms of participation in the company, so that workers can govern their work more effectively at all levels of the company. It seems to me that this is such an articulation that would make it possible to democratize, decommodify, and decarbonize the planet by reforming the way organizations work. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Antoine, for such an interesting contribution. Exactly what we wanted to discuss today. We are at the heart of it. So now let's hear from Denise Kasparian for 12 minutes also, Denise. And after 10 minutes, I will let you know you have 2 last minutes.
Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. I will share the screen. Can you see it? Great. Well, I read too a bit just to be sure everyone can understand a part of what I want to share. Well, I am Denise Kasparian. I wanted to thank you very much, the organizational team and the Wage Indicator Foundation and the Democratized Work Network for this invitation. And as Isabel pointed out, I know there are lots of experts in the room, so I am really eager to afterwards discuss all these presentations together. And Antoine, thank you very much for your presentation. I enjoyed it very much, and it was very clear. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I am a sociologist, although Isabel has already introduced me, just to put a bit more of context to what I'm going to share with you. I am a sociologist, and I have conducted research on cooperativism, worker-recuperated enterprises, social economy, and social movements in Argentina. So I will talk from here. And most recently, I have focused on platform cooperatives. So all these conclusions and ideas I will share draw from these studies. And I will try to briefly answer some of the questions that were suggested in the description of this webinar. And I will refer specifically to worker cooperatives as a feasible way of enabling workers to participate and to govern their work. So I will focus on this kind of participation, the worker co-ops. So first of all, I always feel I have to at least say something about this type of organizations. What are cooperatives? What are worker co-ops? So cooperatives in general are organizations that seek to meet common needs based upon some principles, which are voluntary and open membership, democratic member control, member economic participation, and concern for community. There are different types of cooperatives, and these different types refer to the needs they address. There are public utility cooperatives, consumer cooperatives, and worker cooperatives. This last type of cooperatives are the ones I am going to refer to, the ones in which the workers are also the members of the organization. And one of the main contributions of cooperatives is that they provide decent jobs or work opportunities in more democratic and fair environments than those of traditional companies. So that's one of their main contributions to the economy and societies in general. So one of the first questions of this webinar was if democracy at work is only feasible for highly skilled employees. I thought it was a very interesting question. And to answer to that question, first I would say no, it's not only for high skilled employees. And to support this, I have like 2 examples I've been working with in Argentina. And these are the recuperation of enterprises by their workers. And a second example is a process of state promotion of cooperatives through social policies. I would say a bit about each of these cases. Recuperated enterprises are productive units managed by their workers, which originate from the conversion of capitalist companies. In Argentina, these recuperations spread after an extensive crisis we had in 2001, 2002, and creating these cooperatives was a way of defending jobs. There are different types of worker recuperated enterprises, but there are like three aspects they share. First, that they come from a critical situation in previous companies. In these critical situations, there is often dismissals and non-payment of wages. The second aspect is that they are processes of collective resistance of workers, and in general, or in many cases, they resort to the occupation of the premises as a form of struggle. And the third element is that all these processes of recuperating the enterprises result in an organizational conversion where these enterprises acquire the legal status of worker cooperatives. That's the cases of the recuperation. I know that there are different cases in many countries. In Argentina, we have more or less 400 recuperated enterprises, but I know there are cases in France and in Greece and in other countries. And the other example, perhaps less known in different parts of the world, is after this crisis in 2003, the national government launched a series of schemes to promote worker cooperatives as a strategy of job creation. I know this happened also in other countries in the world and in many countries in Latin America. Progressive governments fostering the creation of worker co-ops as a way to include vulnerable populations and fight against extreme poverty. Well, in these programs, people had to join co-ops and create co-ops to access to the benefit, let's say. These cooperatives activities were grounded in state demand and focused on housing, social infrastructure, and the maintenance of public spaces. In many cases, unemployed workers' organizations and social movements were also involved in these co-ops, and these organizations had to resort to collective actions to be incorporated into the programs. So there were also struggles to be part of these co-ops. And unlike recuperated enterprises, these cooperatives are like the result more of the state initiative, that of the civil society initiative. And instead of self-management, we say that in many of these cooperatives, what we saw was co-management. So by these two examples, I just wanted to highlight that democracy is not only feasible for high-skilled employees, because these two cases are not integrated mainly by highly skilled employees. The second question I found very interesting, and it also relates with this study I made. What does it take to enable workers to truly participate in governance of their own work, because we know it's difficult. I think that worker co-ops at the company level offer like a legal form, a very like well-known legal form that provide ways of formalizing and strengthening workers' self-organization. The shared ownership model and the democratic governance principles of these organizations ensure that cooperatives are driven by the needs of their members. That's crucial to worker co-ops. So I think at the company level, it is an effective tool for worker empowerment. But there is also another benefit of cooperatives, but on a macro level, on a movement level, let's say. Cooperativism is a global movement composed of federations and organizations with more than 100 years of existence, and they have institutional power to advance in beneficial policies, better legal frameworks, and the construction of a cooperative market. I think the movement, it is also important to build identity, because when we think of active participation in organizations, in companies, identity is a key factor. As Antoine said, legal frameworks and law are not the only factor needed, but they are important. And I think that the movement is key to advance these changes. However, although we have these like potentials of the cooperatives, there are factors that pose barriers to the effective participation of workers, even in worker co-ops, or especially in worker co-ops. First, in general, workers lack time to participate in governance and decision-making. So how we guarantee there is time to do this apart from the task assigned to the worker? Then active participation in our jobs and even in our political systems is not fostered in our cultures. So we even need a cultural change. Also, in cooperatives, new capacities and new tasks must be learned. For example, the workers need to know how to manage grants, how to seek for funds. So these are different types of tasks, sometimes not so visible, that need to be learned. Another barrier to active participation I've seen is that it is also difficult to build commitment and to build a sense of belonging with a collective enterprise when in our societies, what we see is individuality, isolation, and flexibility. So these are just some benefits and pitfalls of this form of organization I've seen starting from Argentina, the cases I mentioned. And the third question had to do with the frictions we should expect in this kind of organizations. And this is something I hope I could be clear, because I studied a lot and sometimes it is difficult to sum up lots of work in short period of minutes. So I wanted to share just 4 statements about what frictions we could expect. Well, I think that producing collectively and autonomously represents a daily challenge for workers. So one of the main research questions I tackled through these years has been why, how, and by what groupings does the labor force come into conflict in productive units not structured on wage relations? Why, how, and who enter into conflict when there are no bosses? So one of the first arguments or statements is that I believe the way production is socially organized affects work conflicts. So the idea is that the democratization of production implies democratization of conflict and not its disappearance. I think it is important to focus on the idea that it's not its disappearance, because there is like a romantic or the opposite, stigmatizing vision that thinks about cooperatives as spaces with no conflict, as beautiful and harmonic spaces. What I think, on the contrary, is that the way the production is organized democratizes the workplace, and by activating participation and by activating horizontal dynamics, it also opens up the possibility of disagreements. So I think there is a democratization of conflict, not a disappearance, and that these struggles are not only for self-management, let's say, to get to self-managed work, but also a result of self-management. It's like similar to the first argument, but let's say simpler, this second argument.
And yeah, so you've reached the last 2 minutes, right?
Right, great.
Yes, thank you.
I have two statements, and I think I could close. Well, the second one is that there are new forms and groupings, and these forms of conflict and the groupings that are in these conflicts are more horizontal and more diversified. Also, the claims that these workers do. I had an example to share with you about conflicts in a specific cooperative between founders and newcomers around the regulations of work, but I think that would be like too much for these 2 minutes. But just to mention something, it was interesting to look at this conflict, because what I saw was that a group of founders, the ones who founded the cooperative, because of what they did with the regulations of work, were started to be called not founders but founderers. This means like sinking something or taking that enterprise to bankruptcy, just like the former bosses. So it was interesting to look at this wordplay and the conflict around this wordplay, because it showed that these conflicts in the cooperative were able even to change the balance in power and make it perhaps more beneficial for newcomers instead that for founders. But well, perhaps we can talk about this later, because it will be like too much to explain the conflict, but it was interesting just to see this change in the balance of power and how the symbolic power of the founders can be resisted, can be contested even, and can be changed. And well, the last statement has to do with just to mention that although I think that the way production is organized impacts on conflict, I also believe, just in relation with the last thing I said about the conflict, that the conflict also impacts in the workplace and in the way the production is organized. It's not a unilinear schema, the one I am proposing. So this is the main idea, and thank you very much for the invitation, and let's discuss.
Thanks to you, Denise. Thank you so much. That was extremely interesting as well. And so now we're going to turn to Michel for the last remarks. I'm sorry, my connection here is a bit unstable. So if you see me disappear, Lisa is here to hold the house, but I hope I'll be here around. Michel.
Thank you so much, Isabel. And I first want to appreciate Antoine and Denise's remarks. They reflect a lot of what we experienced in the work that I'm going to talk about, creating coworker.org. And it's always so kind of comforting to hear the same sort of frameworks repeated for workers in multiple parts of the world. So my name is Michelle Miller. I am 3 weeks into my new role at Harvard Law School as the Director of Innovation at the Center for Labor and a Just Economy. In that work, I will have 2 primary areas of focus. One will be identifying intervention points for worker governance over the implementation of technology, things like algorithmic decision-making, artificial intelligence. And then I'll be doing a lot of research on emergent forms of autonomous worker organization, which builds heavily on my prior work running coworker.org. And I'm here today to discuss what we learned from that work, which was a kind of simultaneous effort to both democratize workplaces through direct worker-led organizing and to democratize the functions of the formal labor movement, which in the US and in the trade union model often repeated the same hierarchical decision-making and structures that workers were facing within their workplaces. And I have some slides, but I am going to talk with my face for a little while before I get to them. So my co-founder, Jess Kutch, and I came from the traditional labor movement and conceptualized what became coworker.org starting in 2011. And I just want to provide a little bit of context about what the labor movement in the US was like during that time. The labor movement had been fairly weak for about 30 years plus due to a series of both internal difficulties and external pressures from a very labor-unfriendly government. There was still some electoral political power that the labor movement held, but very little power to impact the economy, very little governance over corporate decision-making. The trade union movement represents about 6% of the private sector workforce in the US. And labor law was, and still is, quite antiquated. Enforcement of the law was very weak. And on top of all of that, cultural norms around the workplace in the US are really individualistic, really celebratory of things like hustle and grind and wealth accumulation, and just this kind of generalized acceptance of the boss-employee paradigm. And a real hope, the only hope that the culture granted to workers was maybe someday you can be your boss, not anything in between. And, you know, your boss is your friend, your boss is your authoritarian. And so that made it very difficult, obviously, to engage in organizing. But in 2011, there were a few things that were suggesting the potential for a shift. There was the what we call the Wisconsin Uprising, which was a mass protest in the state of Wisconsin when the governor tried to remove collective bargaining rights for state workers. We saw like regular people go and protest on behalf of this thing that we had started to believe was not popular, which was that you could negotiate your working conditions. Occupy Wall Street engaged many young people and created a new cultural narrative around the concept of the 1%. And digital campaigning was taking off, and people were using popular technology tools to sort of build new forms of collective power. And so we wondered, my co-founder and I, if we could build a culture of workplace organizing in the midst of this shift around norms through the direct engagement of workers. And what was important for that to work was to discard conventional wisdom and the notion of the legal definition of a trade union and consider any collective of workers a kind of informal union. And so what we did in response to what we were seeing workers do already was we created a digital platform called Coworker, where workers could start campaigns inside of their workplaces. And our wild hope was that if we helped workers run campaigns around things they cared about, they could have a direct experience with building their muscles around collective advocacy, and very importantly, building a sense of hope that if they got together and they worked for democratic authority over some of their working conditions, that they would start to be able to imagine a labor movement and implement a labor movement of the 21st century. And that at the same time, our hope was that the trade unions and other worker institutions would see this activity by workers and also develop a stronger sense of faith in workers' capacity to govern their own working conditions and govern their own organizations. So I can now share my slides. Here we go. So this is the, can everyone see? Are we good? This is the front page of the website. This is not what it looked like when we created it in 2012. It was much uglier, but this is what it looks like now. And the entire thrust of the coworker.org website was about getting people to start campaigns in their workplaces. And so as an example that I think is apropos to this discussion, there is currently a campaign by REI employees. REI is a retail store that sells like outdoor gear, like boots and tents and water bottles. And they are a consumer co-op. But workers at REI right now are demanding that they also have democratic control over the chain. And so to this question of whether cooperative management or democracy at work is something that is only for highly skilled, highly paid employees, this is a great example of retail workers asking for the same kinds of structures in their workplace. I am going to use an early campaign to demonstrate the ways in which coworker.org worked and built this culture around workplace organizing. I will start with, this is a campaign that was created in October of 2014 by a barista in Atlanta, Georgia, named Christy Williams. And she wanted the right for Starbucks baristas to have visible tattoos. What's important about this is that the traditional labor movement found the fact that we were supporting an effort by workers to have visible tattoos to be very silly. And we're often questioned, like, why are you putting resources into this campaign by these workers for something that's not serious, like wages and benefits? And for us, we felt that workers should have the capacity to determine what they ran campaigns on, and that actually the control over the body and the visible, the sort of visible presentation of a worker was directly connected to broader issues of autonomy. And we also had this idea that if workers won a campaign on tattoos, that would instill in them the hope that they could win on these more serious bread and butter issues, that the point was to raise the bar of hope, and the point was to actually use campaigns by these workers to build their networks and relationships. So I am going to show you some slides that try to illustrate how we did that. They are a little goofy, and I don't know if they're going to work, but I tried really hard to draw what has happened over the past 10 years. So please bear with me. So what we have here is the sort of progress of how this tattoos campaign ultimately led to 50,000 Starbucks baristas on coworker.org leading massive campaigns inside their workplace. So through the Visible Tattoos campaign, we got tons of media coverage promoting the fact that these workers were running a campaign on this issue. This meant that way more employees of Starbucks saw the campaign, signed on to the campaign, and it built the network of those employees. So through just the campaign run by the workers for Visible Tattoos, we helped build a network of 15,000 Starbucks baristas. And those baristas shared the campaign in their own networks. They used social media platforms to share it all around, thus growing the network even bigger. When the workers won the campaign for Visible Tattoos, that was the big test, because we wanted to know what would happen next if we told them, hey, you won. Of course, Starbucks said they had always been planning to change that policy, and it had nothing to do with this worker campaign. But, we created a different narrative. And as a result of them winning on that small issue, the next day, there were 6 new campaigns by Starbucks baristas around a variety of issues. And over the course of 10 years, that network has grown and grown and grown, and one substantive change on multiple issues inside their network. So they won scheduling reforms. They ended the use, or they altered the use of the scheduling software that was ruining their lives. They won paid family leave, because in the US, we don't have a right to take time off when we have children. They won safe needle boxes for people to drop in the bathrooms, because there was a lot of drug use in Starbucks bathrooms, and they wanted, the workers were getting poked by needles. And they, because they had built up this network during the pandemic, they won 6 weeks of pay when the cafes had to close. So this is the sort of process for building these mass networks inside of these companies. It's an endless sort of process of workers running campaigns, winning campaigns, and using various technology tools to promote those campaigns. And I'll come back to Starbucks in a minute, but that we built, and workers themselves built, networks just like the Starbucks network in multiple other companies, and touched millions of workers over the course of 10 years, giving them this experience with collective advocacy. To be clear, this was very low bar collective advocacy. Most workers were just signing onto campaigns, receiving emails, reading about themselves in the media. But it did that sort of work of undoing years and years of the predominant culture in this country that said none of this stuff was reasonable or possible. So during the COVID-19 shutdown, Coworker was pretty much the only place most workers had to go to do any kind of collective organizing on their own behalf. And during the first month and a half of the shutdown, we had an astonishing boom in campaigns run by workers. It was a pivotal moment for essential workers, in a moment when people knew that it was only through governance over their own working conditions and the ability to speak to their bosses that they were going to survive, essentially, this moment of shutdown. So just as a statistic, coworker normally supported 15 to 20, maybe 10, maybe 15 campaigns a month in the pre-2020 world. During the shutdown, we were supporting 300 campaigns at once. It was like a huge boom. And what we saw happen next was that from that moment, there started to become more legible forms of worker networks that went from being these email lists, these informal engagements, these efforts at advocacy on a policy by policy basis, to many workers coming together in much more formal things with names that were thinking more broadly than campaign by campaign or policy by policy about how they wanted to shift power in their workplaces. And this is where you started to have people really calling for democratic governance over their working conditions. And I believe that it was a combination of this massive social crisis and this work that had been going on for years and years around building a culture of workplace advocacy and organizing. And it took 10 years to do.
Michelle, I'm so sorry, but just to say that you have 2 minutes left.
Okay, wow. So just to close out, the formal, I'm so sorry, my doorbell's ringing. The sort of formal formal/informal worker organizations that emerged were things like this, Patients Over Profits, this Walgreens committee that is now running a campaign for safe working conditions. There are people organizing around TikTok. Like the work continues in places where there's more work to do to formalize the concept of workers shifting power. Okay, I'm back. And then a number of those informal networks, as you may have read in the news, actually started to become formal trade union efforts inside these companies. So Amazon Labor Union came out of very early warehouse worker organizing and stipends that we provided to organizers in that and the JFK 8 warehouse. The Starbucks Workers United effort came out of many of the stores that were running campaigns. We had Columbia do an analysis of where co-worker campaigns took place and where unionization elections took place in Starbucks stores, and there was a much higher correlation between stores where there had been co-worker efforts and stores where they ultimately organized unions. And what I think is worth pointing out before I close is that the Starbucks Workers United effort is the most democratic unionization effort by a formal trade union I have ever seen. They are really listening to workers. Workers are making decisions about how the campaign develops strategy moving forward. And I think that that, again, is a real reflection of Workers United looking at the efforts that these workers have made and saying they have been doing this in a way that makes sense for them, and we cannot impose our model for organizing or we're going to lose this whole thing. So the question now really is, you know, I'm a little humbled by it because we were part of this cultural change, but we're also coming up against, once again, people actually wanting formal trade unions, but still the law is a barrier and still the state is not friendly. And so what do we do with this sort of new culture around organizing with mostly institutions that cannot hold that excitement. Where do we put that excitement? How do we nurture that excitement? And how do we start to think about other ways that we can build on the momentum that we've generated? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michelle. This is extremely encouraging and at the same time very lucid vis-a-vis the structural problems that we face in capitalist democracies. So I suggest, because we have been a bit longer, but the content was really wonderful. I suggest that if the three panelists or some of you want to react to the other presentations, it is an invitation for you to do so. Otherwise, and I will open the floor to the participants. So does anyone, Antoine, Denise, Michelle, wants to add anything given what was presented? You don't have to. I'm sure you have tons of ideas, but just if something was burning. No? So shall we open? Yeah,
just
Antoine?
maybe Isabelle.
Yeah.
I'm sorry for Michelle. I wanted to ask to Michelle because my English is really bad. So I don't understand if what you did was to observe the networks and their developments, or did you try to interact with these developments and how? I didn't understand this.
Thank you, Antoine. Your English is far better than my French. We provided a lot of support to workers who were running campaigns. We didn't just observe, but we operated according to a set of principles of non-interference. So if we only ever made we only ever helped if workers wanted our help. And we would do strategy calls with them. When we would do media work, it would only be with the workers' permission. So we kind of ended up being technical assistants to workers while they were running campaigns, because we had all of this access to reporters and tech and some money. And so that's sort of how we did it. But we definitely helped when we were asked to help.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for that being clear. Denise?
Thank you. I wanted to make just two short questions. For Antoine, if I didn't get at the beginning if these initiatives were worked together with trade unions, and how the reference for the second phase were elected. And for Michelle, I guess you explained it at the beginning, but perhaps I missed it. Because I think that this coworker.org was, like you said, built upon a culture of workplace democracy that you had been developing, or it has been developed. I wanted to know more about that, because I think it's crucial to understand how this platform works, because there was something built before. Just those things. Thank you.
Let's start with Antoine then.
Yes, so I will try to answer clearly. In the beginning of Lille, it wasn't worked with the unions, trade unions. It was something that came after. But at the start, we encounter each union to speak with them about what we were going to do. But in other experiments, like Renaud Flin, it was an entry point, the condition that in the committee that they discussed, there is unions and directions, and then workers. So it depends on which experiments we speak, but in lean, no, it was not 3 points. But in fact, when the question of how to make this organization still in time, the role of unions, trade unions, was very important, because in a municipality it cannot last for long if there is no dialogue between what we've done with garbage collectors and trade unions. So that's the way they integrated the dispositive. I hope it's clear. And for the election of trade referents, it was in the final process. It's a 6-month election, and this is the workers that vote for colleagues that present themselves to be trade referents, and it is an election organized by direction of the waste collector service, and it was made because we wanted that, and the garbage collectors too wanted that the trade referent to be legitimate towards his colleagues, because sometimes we don't want some colleagues to be referents and speak in our names to the directions, to management. So this question of legitimacy is very important, and that's why this election was think like that.
Okay, thank you, Antoine. Michelle?
Thank you. Denise, is what you're asking, like, was the platform the result of some kind of democratic process? No. We initially created the platform sort of by sensing that people might want something like that, essentially. We were seeing workers use Reddit threads and change.org petitions and letters to Gawker to do what ended up becoming what Coworker was built to support. And so it was kind of this process of seeing a lot of activity that to us was legible as worker organizing, even if people themselves didn't call it that, and to wonder if we put it in one place and we facilitated conversations among people, if that could lead to something. So that's sort of how it started. Is it okay if I ask Antoine and Denise questions?
Yes, it's okay. But we have 25 minutes left because we need to finish on time. So would that be okay that we first collect now questions, and we can start with you, but we're going to collect a few thoughts, questions, comments from the whole audience, and then we'll come back to the three of you, and probably you won't be able to address everything, but you will pick whatever issues you want to dig deeper into. Okay, so shall we start with you, Michelle?
You know what? I'm going to defer to the group because I'll bet someone else will ask my question, and I've talked enough.
Well, then we see, and you come back with your questions if they've not been raised. Okay, wonderful. So now it's the time to extend this opportunity to interact with every participant. There are a few questions already in the chat. I wonder, Lisa, if you want to raise your question orally, and we can start with you and collect a few comments and questions
I
then.
think others were before me, so I think Martin and
Sorry?
Christine, if they can talk, they should actually go first.
That's right. Maybe Martin and Christina, do you want also to raise your question, or do you want me to do it?
No, for me it's okay to raise. I also put it also in the chat for the needs. Also, thanks for your presentation, and really nice also to have a nuanced contribution, because many platform cooperatives there are only hype away, and I really like the balance in the benefits and the opportunities and the risk of that. My question is that I feel that traditionally work cooperatives were quite homogeneous, and workers were involved for many years with one organization. Then when you look to the gig economy, the platform economy, my feeling is that the population of workers is much more diverse, much more heterogeneous in all aspects, and they're also not really engaged to the platform. So their effective commitment is really low. Do you also see, when you compare traditional worker cooperatives and platform worker cooperatives with each other, also differences in how this governance and participation works or doesn't work?
Thank you, Martin. Thank you so much. I guess that's also a question on which Tim Christians could weigh in. So Tim, let us know. But then let's go to
Hello, I don't know, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right.
I'll-
So, okay, so I'm actually in a very favorable position because Martin gave me a great introduction, because gig economy is something in line with the question I'm interested in, and that is Gen Z, because as we all know, the gig economy is mainly participated by the youngest working force. So this goes hand in hand. And my question refers especially to Denise, since it's most of the sociological part of the let's say worker governance, democratic regulation and influence, because as we know, the Gen Z is not that much, at least in these phases, which is still a bit early to say, but they are not that much getting involved in the culture. They do not tend to stay in the companies for long. They are seeking for other ways to have more prosperous conditions instead of staying put and waiting for some, let's say, promised time. So in this context, maybe you can give us, and not only the needs, but since it's a cultural thing, I was drawn to by the part of your presentation about giving maybe some of your overview of how you are expecting things might develop in the future. And thank you for the lovely presentation, very interesting overview from different aspects.
Lisa, shall I let you continue? Because I don't want this to happen again.
Well,
I'm so
you're
sorry.
here now, so let's just see. We'll play it by the ear. So I'd be thanks for these great presentations. I'd be very interested in what you experienced or learned about the dynamics of these movements. Where there are moments where things are going well, lots of people are signing up, maybe because of the crisis, or Denise talked about these cases where the crisis leads to the need to start something new. But then maintaining the dynamic seems to be a huge challenge. And I'd be interested in hearing a bit more whether you've seen moments where there was a loss of momentum, but then maybe it was possible to revive it again. And you know, what was it? What kept it going in some cases, maybe not in others? What did you see there in your work? Thank you very much.
Shall we still collect? Well, I see a lot of input also in the chat. So should we, do the panelists want to react? Maybe because we have already a strong collection of input. So, but let's try to maybe go for like 2 minutes each, so that we still have more time for further exchange. Shall we start with Antoine?
Yes, maybe I can try to respond to Lisa with the difficulty that occurs in this process. And there was a lot, but I didn't have time to present that to you in 12 minutes, but because it's an experimentation that takes since 2016, so it's a very long time. But there were, for example, unions that were destabilized by the creation of this function of referent trade referent, because they thought at the first time that this is their work to collect problems from the field and to discuss it with in the bodies that are that are made for that. But in fact, what they discover is that they could not understand these problems in the same way that garbage collectors, because garbage collectors are in the truck between the day, and they can analyze a lot of problems that unions cannot. So they finally discovered that it was a resource for negotiating in their work, in their activity. So unions sometimes they felt they were cooperating in a suspect way with direction. They could have felt that. And for the referent wanted to stop several times because direction was not following the analysis they did, and they wanted to stop. They wrote a letter to explain to management why they could stop, and we worked this letter with the management, and we discussed it, and they came to present it and to argument about the stopping of their activity of trade referent. And finally, they continue it, but it's really vulnerable. That's what I want to say. It's not the great world. It's really vulnerable and difficult.
Thank you, Antoine. Denise?
Thank you for the questions, Martina and Cristina. I have lots of things to say, but just some of them. I would add, well, first that the pitfalls I mentioned were actually like clear for me when I started to study platform co-ops. So I would say it's even more difficult, the issue of time, the issue of commitment, and the issue of the sense of belonging when we talk about digital labor and platforms. Then I would add another aspect that makes it more difficult. In the cases I studied in Argentina, the worker recuperated enterprises and the social policies co-ops, workers didn't have other options. It was like to defend jobs, to access work, they were the only ways. But when we think about digital labor, workers have lots of platforms to work, and they don't have to assume that those other tasks I talk about grant management or fund seeking. So they can make the same tasks without assuming other activities. So it is difficult to compete as a labor option with these platforms. But on the other side, I think that there are like important aspects that could help. For example, that the cooperative movement is global, as are platforms. So I think that that's something that could help. Like this global movement could help build global platforms too, global cooperative platforms too. Also that the digital economy, or perhaps the the shared economy, at the beginning was built upon community values and democratic values and solidaristic values. So cooperatives have words and have narratives to resort to. I think that words and ideas that ring a bell to the workers of platforms to share, to be collaborative. So it's not like to start from scratch for cooperatives, I think. Then that there are lots of digital democracy tools available that these kind of workers could use to debate, to discuss, to make decisions. I think that's another interesting resource. And then another an example to think about this generation Cristina talked about. I've been working also with tech worker co-ops in Argentina. And I think it's like the generation you talked about. And not only the generation, but that they have a very thriving market, private market to work, but they choose to work in co-ops. When I work with them, when I listen to them, I hear that it is very important to have an autonomy when they work, but to have that autonomy in a context where there is a group and a collective to support when there are problems, when they need to count on someone. So although this generation tends to change jobs and to, well, not to commit, I think that by working in this identity and by showing that the collective can support and at the same time provide autonomy, I think it's something important in co-ops.
Thank you, Denise. Michelle?
Yes, thank you for these really good questions. To address, Christina, your question, my experience has been quite similar to Denise's. What we have seen among younger workers is that while they have a limited commitment to company culture, they have a really strong commitment to mutualist cultures and to their own sort of solidarity communities. And one core thing that we have noticed is that often for workers who have engaged in some kind of workplace campaign, sort of the presumption of the labor movement is always that, and then you move and you do more with the organization, and then you move and you do more, and you stay really connected to one organization. But what we've seen is that they carry the principles of collective advocacy and democracy into other parts of their economic lives. So we had a worker move straight into organizing a tenants union in her apartment building. We've had many workers get involved with the debt movement in the US. We've had workers get involved in various other community efforts, and certainly through our Solidarity Fund, we've seen that happen as well. And so I think that the value set remains and then is expressed in a bunch of different ways. And then to your question, Lisa, about kind of stalling and friction and what happens when it doesn't go well, a lot of what our staff who support workers ultimately end up doing is counseling people through these really difficult times. When a campaign doesn't take off and doesn't get a lot of signatures, when no one wants to cover it in the news media, when you've been at it for 6 months and you did all the right things and the company is still not moving, those are really demoralizing moments. And sometimes the best thing that we've been able to do is to just kind of stand in recognition of that. And many of those workers, we had a worker who took on Etsy, which is the platform for artisanal stuff. And that campaign never won, but he ended up training other tech workers through our tech worker organizing work on their campaigns. And so, and that ended up being a really positive experience for him. And so I think it's about kind of acknowledging how much capital is stacked against us and then figuring out the ways that people can stay engaged in other ways. but not pretending that it doesn't really suck when you lose a campaign.
Thank you so much. So shall we have our final round of questions? Does anyone want to raise a question that's not in the chat, but that she or he is ready to share? Not necessarily, or a comment or a reflection. Well, we have a few ones in the chat. And so does any of those who put their comments in the chat wants to speak about it? Or shall I just go through them? Okay, so I'll go through them. There is this concern that Barbara Krug raised, which is that if we wonder about cases of workers' participation in company context, there is obviously the experience of the German Betriebsrat Works Council, which has a very long history and which indeed can speak for the challenges and also the practical experience that workers can gain through that history. Has any of the panelists any thought about that? So does that confrontation with history is an interesting input, and how do you relate to that experience, I guess, is the question. There is also a question about the new challenges that democratic organizing bring when it can potentially clash with a production system that requires a hierarchy. I think that speaks to also what Denise raised, but Thabo is asking for more input about that. Also, Amana Ferro suggests that people in the nonprofit sector face the same type of challenges, and that so it might be relevant to speak more largely about these work contexts and not to identify them too much with an employer that is an employer of a standard company, I guess, because actually these challenges of related to worker organizing and worker governing actively their work is very much present in the public sector, in the nonprofit sector, obviously. And I guess I'll finish. So I see Elvira. How do the new ways of participating articulate with more traditional trade union actions, rivalry, combination? I think that's certainly a theme, and that's the point I'm going to just sort of highlight, is that indeed we could see very clearly in Michel, I think, remarks how organizing at this very local level can actually power real formal unionizing, but it's not necessarily it's certainly not sort of a natural dynamic. It doesn't happen just by itself. It has to be strategically brought in. But it's clear that there is a deep connection between these expectations of workers having a say, trying to weigh in, trying to find the ways to organize themselves, and the history of the labor movement, which is just coming out of that same experience. So how to make sure that at the level of each fight, that connection is actually made, that traditional unions see the point of getting involved, trying to support, etc. I think it speaks also for their openness to change themselves internally and certainly be attuned to these democratic challenge that these new ways of organizing bring to their old, more hierarchical structure. And I think Michelle also of issues here still to discuss, but let me suggest the three panelists have like 1 or 2 minutes, not more than that. Antoine?
Yes, I just can try to respond to the comments on the workers' participation in Germany, because I don't have the level of English to go in this discussion, but I can say that if we look at the Dieselgate and the problem that Volkswagen had, it shows in a certain way that the organization, even if there are indirect structure of participation, it showed that organization can dysfunctions and provoke pollution, and the worker participation as it is couldn't stop it. So there is something that we could take time to discuss about the German model. And that's it.
Thank you. Thank you, Antoine. Denise?
Thank you. And I think the question was from Tabo. I don't see him anymore. But what I could say briefly is that the production, it changed the way it is organized, and the hierarchies change. They are redesigned, and the workers collectively assume the direction of the production, and they rethink who oversees production, how they do it, how they choose those people. So the way production is organized changed a lot, and hierarchies too. But this is also part of the defining these new hierarchies also lead to conflicts. But what I would say is that the production, how it is organized, changed a lot, although there are still hierarchies. But then we could discuss more, perhaps.
Certainly. Thank you, Denise. Michelle?
I'm going to rattle off a bunch of responses. One, many workers in the US are incredibly inspired by the Works Council model in Germany and see that as a kind of horizon goal for what they're trying to get to. It's the most legible model they have. And to the point about the nonprofit sector, specifically as a place where lots of people are organizing. In the US, there's been a massive boom in workers at political, specifically nonprofits, engaging in unionization and organizing, and it has revealed some weaknesses in the predominant kind of employer-employee paradigm because of the slightly different ways in which political nonprofits are organized. Yet, to this point about when do you need hierarchy, many of the structures of funding and coalition building and engagement in the nonprofit sector are rooted in a very hierarchical model that requires there to be an executive director who represents everything. And there is a massive amount of conversation and examination in the US progressive nonprofit movement about how, in order to live the values that are being requested by the workers in the nonprofits, the way the nonprofits relate to the superstructure has to change. And this is a whole panel in and of itself, but it's a really fascinating kind of moment of trying to figure out how you democratize work essentially in the nonprofit sector.
I think Isabel is frozen now again, so it falls on me to close the session. Apologies for that. thank you all so much for joining, and a particular round of applause and thanks to our 3 speakers. We have another webinar coming up, and Shantanu, who is one of the people in the background that I also want to thank once more for setting up everything and sending out emails and so on. He has just shared the screen with the next webinar coming up is on March 22nd, and it would be great to see many of you there. Thank you very much for all the work many people here in the room are doing on these things. Keep up the good spirits, keep up the fight, and have a wonderful weekend. Thank you so much.